In the heart of the ancient world, one empire rose above all others. It was a civilization built on sheer military might, breathtaking architecture, and a bureaucracy so brutally efficient it would become the blueprint for future conquerors. This was the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and at its absolute zenith, it was ruled by a man of shocking, almost unbelievable contradictions. He was a scholar, a linguist, a librarian, a man so obsessed with knowledge that he gathered the wisdom of the entire world into a single, magnificent collection. He preserved the myths, the sciences, and the histories of Mesopotamia for all time. He was a patron of the arts, a builder of cities, a man who called himself the king of the world. But this man had another side, a side so dark, so steeped in terror, his name would be whispered in fear for centuries. He was a warlord who bragged about creating mountains of severed heads. He was a conqueror who flayed his enemies alive and nailed their skins to city walls. He was a king who, by his own proud admission, sowed fields with salt and burned entire cities to the ground, people and all. How can these two realities exist in one person? How could the man who built one of history's first great libraries also be a monster who reveled in genocide? This is the story of that man, Ashurbanipal, the Scholar King. He skinned rebels alive and boasted of burning their cities to ash. He was a conqueror who reveled in terror and bloodshed. But this same man created one of the first great libraries in the world, preserving knowledge that would shape the course of human history. This is the story of Ashurbanipal, the Scholar King who was also a monster. To understand him is to understand that the foundations of civilization are often built with both ink and blood. In the 7th century BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was the undisputed superpower of the Near East. Its armies were disciplined, its technology was terrifying, and its ambition knew no bounds. At the center of this web of power was the Sargonid dynasty, a line of warrior kings who had carved out an empire that stretched from the mountains of Persia to the floodplains of Egypt. Into this world, around 685 BCE, a boy named Ashurbanipal was born. His name meant, "The god Ashur is creator of an heir," a pretty grand title for a boy who was never supposed to be king. He wasn't the firstborn son of the reigning king, Esarhaddon. In fact, he was probably the fourth. He had an older brother, Shamash-Shumukin, who was being groomed for power in the traditional Assyrian way. While his brothers learned the arts of war and statecraft, Ashurbanipal was steered down a very different path. Maybe the king saw a different kind of spark in his younger son, or maybe it was just tradition for a prince who wasn't in the direct line of succession. Whatever the reason, Esarhaddon gave Ashurbanipal a rigorous scholarly education. This was highly unusual for a future Assyrian king. Rulers were meant to be warriors and commanders, not scribes hunched over clay tablets. And yet, Ashurbanipal didn't just study, he excelled. He dove into his work with a passion that bordered on obsession. He learned to read and write in multiple languages, including the ancient and complex Sumerian, which was already a dead language, sort of like a modern scholar learning Latin or ancient Greek. He devoured texts on math, medicine, history, and religion. He became one of the very few kings in Mesopotamian history who was fully literate, and he was incredibly proud of it. In his own inscriptions, he'd later boast, "I, Ashurbanipal, absorbed the wisdom of Nabu. I can decipher intricate mathematical problems. I have perused subtly crafted texts in recondite Sumerian and Akkadian that are challenging to interpret." He even had himself carved in royal reliefs with a stylus, the pen of the ancient world, tucked into his belt, a clear symbol of his brainpower. While his older brother was learning how to lead an army, Ashurbanipal was learning how to read the omens of the gods. But fate had other plans. Esarhaddon's firstborn son and chosen heir died unexpectedly, throwing the king's succession plans into chaos. Esarhaddon, a man described as deeply paranoid after his own difficult rise to power, decided to do something radical to prevent a civil war between his remaining sons. In 672 BCE, he bypassed his older son, Shamash Shamukin, and named the scholar prince Ashurbanipal as the heir to the Assyrian throne in the capital of Nineveh. To placate his older son, he gave him the prestigious, but lesser, kingship of Babylon. Esarhaddon forced the nobles of the empire to swear a solemn oath to uphold this dual monarchy, to make sure Shamash Shamukin would stay loyal to his younger brother. It was a plan born of desperation. But by elevating the bookish younger son over the elder, he planted a seed of resentment that would one day explode into a catastrophic war. In 669 BCE, Esarhaddon died. Suddenly, the young man who had spent his life in libraries found himself on the throne of the most powerful and brutal empire on earth. Ashurbanipal, the scholar, was now Ashurbanipal, king of the universe. And the world was about to find out what happens when a mind full of ancient knowledge is given command of the world's most terrifying war machine. Once on the throne, Ashurbanipal launched a project that would become his most enduring legacy, an achievement that stood in stark contrast to the bloodshed that defined his reign. He set out to create the greatest library the world had ever seen. This wasn't just a royal hobby. It was a systematic, state-sponsored mission on an unprecedented scale. Ashurbanipal was driven by a genuine, burning desire to possess all the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamia. He saw himself not just as a conqueror, but as a preserver of a culture stretching back thousands of years. The library he built in his palace at Nineveh was his attempt to create a complete, immortal record of human thought. To stock his library, Ashurbanipal sent scribes to every corner of his vast empire. His orders were clear: find and copy every significant text in existence. He wrote to the ancient temples and learning centers in cities like Babylon, demanding they send their literary treasures to his capital. And these weren't polite requests. He used his fearsome reputation to his advantage, essentially ordering the intellectual surrender of his subjects. One of his letters reads, "Hunt for the valuable tablets which are in your archives and which do not exist in Assyria, and send them to me. No one shall withhold a tablet from you. And when you see any tablet or ritual text which is suitable for the palace, take it and send it to me." War loot also became a key source for new acquisitions. When his armies sacked a city, alongside the gold and slaves, they were ordered to seize entire libraries. After the brutal civil war with his brother, thousands of tablets were confiscated from the private collections of Babylonian scholars and carted off to Nineveh. The library's sheer scale and organization were revolutionary. Over 30,000 clay tablets were meticulously collected, copied, and cataloged. Each tablet was inscribed with a colophon, an ancient copyright notice, stating it was from the palace of Ashurbanipal, often verifying that it had been copied from an older original and checked for accuracy. The collection was astonishingly diverse. It had what you'd expect: royal letters, laws, and treaties. But it went so much further. There were thousands of omen texts, which the Assyrians believed were vital for predicting the future. This was likely a primary motivation for the library, controlling the knowledge needed to maintain power. There were medical texts with detailed diagnoses, astronomical observations, dictionaries, and complex mathematical problems. And then there was the literature. For the first time, a ruler had gathered the great epics and myths of his culture into one place. The library held the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth. It held the story of Adapa, a mortal who nearly achieved immortality. And most famously, it held the most complete version we have of the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest great works of literature in human history. The epic tale of a hero king's quest for eternal life, including a story of a great flood eerily similar to the one in the book of Genesis, was preserved for all of us because of this one king's obsession. The library of Ashurbanipal was more than just a collection of tablets. It was a state-of-the-art intellectual center designed to give the king an unparalleled resource for running the empire. Without it, our understanding of the ancient Near East would be a shadow of what it is today. As historian H.G. Wells later put it, it's the most precious source of historical material in the world. This was the golden side of Ashurbanipal, the scholar king, the enlightened ruler, the preserver of civilization. But this palace of wisdom was funded by plunder from conquered cities. The peace required for such scholarly work was maintained through a deliberate policy of terror. And behind this veneer of scholarship lay a heart of darkness. While one of Ashurbanipal's hands was carefully collecting the world's knowledge, the other was drenched in blood. He was, first and foremost, an Assyrian king, and the Assyrian Empire was built on psychological warfare. For them, cruelty wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a calculated and widely publicized tool of the state, designed to terrify subjects into submission. And Ashurbanipal was its grandmaster. His own royal records, far from being dry accounts, are boastful, gory catalogs of his brutality. He didn't just defeat his enemies. He annihilated them and made sure the entire world knew about it in excruciating detail. These weren't confessions. They were press releases from a regime of terror. Rebellion was met with a level of savagery that's hard to comprehend. Of one rebel leader, he writes, "I pierced his chin with my sharp, personal dagger. Through his jaw I passed a rope, put a dog chain on him, and made him guard a kennel at the eastern gate of Nineveh." Another defeated king was forced to live in a dog kennel, a public spectacle of total humiliation. But that was a mild punishment in Ashurbanipal's toolkit. His preferred methods were far more gruesome. One of his favorite tactics was flaying, skinning his enemies alive. He boasts, "Their skin I flayed, and with their skins I covered the wall of the city." Imagine the psychological impact of that. Seeing the skin of your former leaders nailed to the gates of your own city. A grotesque warning to anyone who even thought about defying Assyria. Mutilation was standard practice. For those who spoke against him, the punishment was poetically cruel. "I cut out the tongues of the soldiers whose slanderous mouths had uttered blasphemies against my God. The rest of the people I threw down alive. I fed their cut-up flesh to the dogs, pigs, vultures, eagles, the birds of heaven, and the fish of the deep." His military campaigns weren't just wars of conquest. They were exercises in extermination. His greatest wrath was aimed at the kingdom of Elam to the east. After a series of conflicts, he finally brought the full might of the Assyrian army down on the Elamite capital of Susa. His description of the event isn't just a record of victory. It's a proud proclamation of genocide. He wrote, "Susa, the great holy city. I conquered. I entered its palaces. I opened their treasuries. I destroyed the ziggurat of Susa. I smashed its shining copper horns. I reduced the temples of Elam to naught. Their gods and goddesses I scattered to the winds." He didn't stop there. He desecrated the graves of their kings, dragging their bones back to Assyria to deny them an afterlife. He destroyed their culture, their fields, their statues. And then came the final, chilling declaration. "For a distance of a month and 25 days' journey, I devastated the provinces of Elam. Salt and thistles I scattered over them. The noise of people, the tread of cattle and sheep, the glad shouts of rejoicing, I banished from its fields." He systematically erased a civilization. Reliefs carved into his palace walls at Nineveh show these horrors for all to see. One famous relief shows Ashurbanipal and his queen enjoying a peaceful banquet in a garden. It seems idyllic until you notice it. Hanging from a tree branch like a piece of fruit is the severed head of the defeated Elamite king. This wasn't a secret shame, it was a decorative centerpiece. And what of the charge that gives this story its title? In his annals, Ashurbanipal boasts of the punishments inflicted on his rebellious brother's supporters. He speaks of burning them in a great fire, a blaze that would have consumed men, women, and, inevitably, children. The Assyrian method was one of collective punishment. When they burned a city, they burned its people without distinction. This was the dark side of Ashurbanipal, a man for whom knowledge and terror weren't opposites, but two sides of the same coin of absolute power. The resentment his father's succession plan had created was destined to boil over. The dual monarchy, one empire, two kings, two brothers, was never going to last. While Ashurbanipal ruled from the imperial capital of Nineveh, his older brother, Shamash-Shum-ukin, governed the ancient and proud city of Babylon. For years, a tense peace held, but Ashurbanipal never treated his brother as an equal. Inscriptions show that Ashurbanipal was the real power, dictating his brother's policies and keeping him on a very short leash. Shamash-Shum-ukin was king of Babylon in name only. In reality, he was a glorified governor, a puppet dancing on strings pulled from Nineveh. All the while, he was becoming more and more Babylonian, restoring their temples and championing their cause, which only put more distance between him and his Assyrian roots. By 652 BCE, after 16 years of this humiliation, Shamash-Shum-ukin had had enough. He decided to make a bid for true power. He secretly began to build a grand coalition of Assyria's enemies, from the Elamites and Chaldeans to the Arabs and Medes. His message was simple: Ashurbanipal wants to enslave you, and only I, your true king, can lead you to freedom. When Ashurbanipal discovered the plot, he claimed to be deeply wounded by the betrayal from his faithless brother. But his response wasn't sorrowful negotiation. It was swift, overwhelming force. The Great Assyrian Civil War had begun. The conflict was a brutal, sprawling war that tore the empire apart for 4 long years. Shamash-Shum-ukin's coalition, though wide, proved fragile. Ashurbanipal's armies were just too experienced, too disciplined, and too ruthless. They first moved to crush the Elamites, neutralizing their most powerful ally. Then, they turned their full attention on Babylonia. One by one, the rebel cities were besieged and crushed. By 650 BCE, the fight was pushed back to Babylon itself. Ashurbanipal's army surrounded the great city, and one of the most horrific sieges in ancient history began. For 2 years, the people of Babylon held out. Ashurbanipal's own annals paint a grim picture of the conditions inside. Famine gripped the city so fiercely that, in his words, the desperate citizens ate the flesh of their sons and daughters. It was a slow, agonizing descent into hell. The end came in 648 BCE. With his cause utterly lost and the Assyrian army breaching the walls, Shamash-Shum-ukin chose his own fate. Rather than face capture and the humiliating death his brother surely had planned, he set his own palace on fire and threw himself into the flames. He died in an inferno, consumed by the very palace from which he had dreamed of ruling. Ashurbanipal's victory was absolute, but it came at a tremendous cost. The war had exhausted the empire's resources. The brutal sacking of Babylon that followed only fanned the flames of hatred for Assyria, setting the stage for the empire's eventual downfall. In his records, Ashurbanipal is strangely reserved about his brother's death, claiming the gods themselves delivered a cruel death by fire. He couldn't bring himself to directly admit to killing his own brother, but the victory was hollow. He had preserved his empire by destroying his own family, proving that for Ashurbanipal, no bond, not even blood, was stronger than his grip on power. This brutal war was the ultimate expression of his character. The scholar who treasured Babylonian knowledge, and the tyrant who would burn Babylon to the ground to keep it. After the fires of Babylon cooled, Ashurbanipal stood at the absolute peak of his power. He had vanquished his brother, crushed his enemies, and in 639 BCE, he celebrated a massive triumph in Nineveh. In a final display of dominance, he had his chariot pulled not by horses, but by 4 captive kings he had defeated. In his own eyes, he was invincible. He had all the knowledge and all the power. But empires, like people, are mortal. The last years of Ashurbanipal's reign are a mystery. The boastful war records and grand construction projects just stop. The once mighty king fades from the historical record. We know the constant warfare had critically weakened the empire. The terror that held it all together was losing its grip, replaced by a deep and universal hatred for Assyrian rule. Ashurbanipal died around 631 BCE, likely of illness, leaving behind a hollowed-out empire. His death unleashed the very chaos he had spent his life trying to suppress. Civil war erupted between his sons, and the empire's enemies, sensing weakness, began to close in. The end came with shocking speed. A new Babylonian empire, hungry for revenge, rose up and allied with the Medes. Together, they launched a final, overwhelming assault on the Assyrian heartland. In 612 BCE, just 19 years after Ashurbanipal's death, the great city of Nineveh, the eternal capital, the heart of the war machine, the home of the world's greatest library, was besieged, captured, and utterly destroyed. The conquerors showed Assyria the same mercy Assyria had shown the world: none. The city was burned to the ground. And here, in that final, violent cataclysm, lies the ultimate paradox of Ashurbanipal's legacy. As his grand palace burned, the mud brick walls collapsed. The thousands of clay tablets from his magnificent library, neatly arranged on wooden shelves, came crashing down. But the intense heat of the inferno didn't destroy the clay tablets. Instead, it fired them solid, baking them like pottery in a kiln. The very disaster that destroyed Ashurbanipal's empire ended up preserving his greatest achievement. Buried under the rubble, the library lay hidden for over 2,000 years, until archaeologists rediscovered it in the 19th century, unearthing a treasure trove of knowledge that resurrected the lost world of Mesopotamia. So, who was Ashurbanipal? The scholar king who saved ancient wisdom from being forgotten? Or the genocidal tyrant whose name meant terror? The truth is, he was both. He was a product of his time and place, a ruler of an empire that saw knowledge as a tool of power and cruelty as its necessary partner. His legacy is a stark reminder that civilization and savagery can, and often do, go hand in hand. He built a library with one hand while burning cities with the other, forever embodying the shocking duality of our own quest for greatness. What do you think? Can a person's good deeds ever outweigh their atrocities? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to explore more dark and fascinating corners of history, make sure to subscribe for more stories from the ancient world.